Today's video is brought to you by War and Peace. If you're really big into history and a fan of the American Civil War, then this mobile, real-time strategy game is not to be missed. It combines base building with multiplayer strategy and tactics. You can even team up with a friend in order to accomplish your objectives. The game employs authentic Civil War weapons and artillery, and you can choose which side you wish to engage. Play as either the head of the Union as Abraham Lincoln or the Confederacy as Jefferson Davis. Aside from the regular play, the developers have integrated special events which use Civil War battle maps that are based on historical battles. Plus, they have included multiple generals for you to use which are based on Civil War personalities, each having individual skills and bonuses. So if you fancy yourself a commander, I've provided a link for the game below in the description. You can click on that link and get started today. And now for the video you've been waiting for. The Castilian siege of Gibraltar had dragged on for many months. This was a testament to the ingenuity of her defenders. The Nasrid, the dynastic rulers of Granada, had taken ownership of the city in 1333 and had set to work on the defenses. Like with many of their other cities, they had rendered it into a fortress. However, every morning the Nasrid garrison watched as the siege camp that surrounded them grew ever bigger. This was Alphonso XI's second attempt to take Gibraltar, and the warrior king of Castile was more determined than ever. After his great victory over the Marinids of North Africa at the Battle of Rio Salado, the Granadans were on their own and essentially up against the ropes. Meanwhile, Alfonso was in the prime of his life. He had a vast army, he had the initiative, and a lot of money. But it was rumored that he had gone so far as to liquidate the crown jewels to pay for even more reinforcements. This king wanted to complete the Reconquista so badly that he could taste it, and Gibraltar was a major stepping stone to that conquest. Thus, he was fully committed, and therefore the hum of activity on the other side of Gibraltar's walls had gotten progressively louder over the months. The sound would have been overwhelming: the constant taunts, the creation of siege towers, cannon slowly being moved into position, and men marching and refining their weapons, all with the intent that one day they'd be able to either starve the Muslims out or, plan B, storm the defenders and, with any luck, kill them. Now, whether the defenders simply got used to this scene or if there was a justifiably increasing panic within their ranks is hard to say. But in March of 1350, something very odd happened. The noise began to diminish and a strange silence descended on the Castilian camp. Now, in my mind, I imagine some poor unfortunate soul having to draw the short straw and, under the cover of a moonless night, having to venture forth to figure out what was going on. If so, this man would have come back screaming. He would have discovered an enemy siege camp that was full of dead bodies. The plague here had done its sinister work. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, thought to be the main culprit to the Black Death, had killed off a big chunk of the Castilian army, and the bacteria made no distinction between rank and royalty. Amongst all those bodies was the corpse of Alfonso XI. One of the most aggressive and militarily skillful kings of Castile was cut down at the height of his power, and mind you, just as he was on the verge of completing the Reconquista. By this point in history, the Black Death had been killing in Europe for well over 3 years and would still have another 3 years to go. While it would kill off more than a third of the European population, it would ironically save Nasrid Granada. The contemporary historian Ibn al-Khatib would comment, quote, "King Alfonso was within reach of obtaining the whole peninsula, yet as he besieged Gibraltar, Allah in his great wisdom favored the faithful in their extremity." End quote. A new page had been turned in the fortunes of Granada, which at this point seemed like it was on the verge of annihilation. The Sultan, Yusuf I, may have sensed this change, and as a gesture of goodwill, he not only allowed the remains of the Castilian army to retreat back to Seville through his territory in peace, but he also allowed them to carry the body of their king with them. Now, some claim that this was just an act of chivalry. I would say that this was an act of skillful diplomacy. Yusuf was in it to play the long game, and he already had his eyes set on rebuilding his kingdom. Yusuf was someone who could see a step or two ahead, and he knew that with the death of Alphonso XI, along with most of his impressive army, that a new equilibrium would be established. Essentially, he wanted to win the peace, but Yusuf was not going to be able to enjoy this new playing field for very long. A mere 4 years later, on October 19th in the year 1354, as he was praying in a mosque in Granada, a man rushed up, evaded his guard, and plunged a dagger directly into his back. Now, according to some accounts, this attacker was a madman, whereas others have him down as being a hired assassin. But either way, the end result would have worked out exactly the same. The Sultan cried out for help, but his followers could do little but watch as the pool of blood beneath him expanded. He was carried back to his private chambers in the Alhambra, only to die shortly thereafter. With the death of this Sultan, it was now time for a new generation of leadership, both in Granada and in Castile. Yusuf I was succeeded by his son Muhammad V in 1354. Alfonso XI was succeeded by his son Peter of Castile in 1350. Both men would be approximately 16 years old when they respectively came to power. Both would be destined to leave interesting legacies. And ironically enough, considering how belligerent their fathers were towards one another, these two men would instead be friends, and between the two of them would usher in a time of peace and prosperity between the Kingdom of Castile and the Sultanate of Granada. The story of the king and the sultan was perhaps one of the most intriguing in history, but it's with Muhammad V that our tale really begins. His rise to power was difficult to say the least because Granada had many contenders for the crown, and to complicate matters, his father had named him heir to the sultanate at the very last second, which, as can be imagined, bred considerable discontent with his half-brothers, who seemed to know how to hold a grudge. However, Muhammad V had the backing of his father's Hajib, his chamberlain, who commanded the Guzat, which was the famous elite cavalry corps. If you're coming to power, always helps to have the military behind you. He also had the backing of his father's most prominent vizier, statesman, and preeminent scholar, a man by the name of Ibn al-Khatib. So Muhammad had the brains and the brawn on his side. These men, along with the remains of his father's cabinet, initially, emphasis on that word, nurtured the young sultan and guided him well. Muhammad V was remembered for many things, but his strength lay in his diplomatic abilities. His first order of business was to cement the peace and secure his borders. Granada, after all, was still recovering from the military onslaught of Alphonso XI. Thus, Muhammad sent out delegations to the Marinids of Morocco, the Hafsids of Tunis, and even so far as the Mamluks of Egypt. He also sent envoys to the court of Aragon, but his biggest neighbor and number one priority was the Kingdom of Castile to the north. The Sultan was quick to reestablish his position as Peter of Castile's vassal, which on one end meant that he had to pay tribute, but on the other, it also implied that the Castilian king would provide protection. However, this turned out to be a double-edged sword. Peter of Castile, who would later be known by many other names, more on that in a bit, would go to war against Aragon in 1358. Muhammad, as his vassal, was obliged to provide military support. Thus, Granada got sucked into this war in more or less a supportive role. For example, Muhammad V would open up his Mediterranean ports to Castilian ships for the purposes of resupply and dry dock. But later, as the war expanded, Nasrid land and sea forces were also sent into the fray. Now keep in mind that Granada had been heavily ravaged by the Black Death and really didn't have the capacity for a prolonged conflict. This war would prove to be both unpopular and massively consuming for the new sultan, and his enemies were quick to exploit it. In August of 1359, the coup began. Assassins were sent into the Alhambra by Muhammad V's half-brother, Ismail II, and his cousin, who'd be known to history as Muhammad VI. Many members of the upper aristocracy were killed, but the young sultan, along with his vizier, Ibn al-Khatib, along with the remaining members of his cabinet, managed to escape, and not just the city, but the entire peninsula. And this is where Muhammad V's diplomatic finesse paid off. He was welcomed with honors into the Marinid court in Fez, where he'd go into exile. Ibn al-Khatib would render this expulsion into poetry. Quote, "The hand of exile has already sown the seeds of mourning, and our chests have become constricted by the anguish that burns within them. We cried one evening by the river's sweet waters, and the waters turned to salt." End quote. Peter of Castile at this time was too busy engaged in the war against Aragon to come to his aid, and so Ismail II claimed the throne of Granada and was backed up by his co-conspirator, the aforementioned Muhammad VI. The young poor sultan, now in exile, had lost his proverbial crown at the tender age of 21. This happened a mere 5 years after coming to power and took place by the hand of his own family. Muhammad V would remain in exile in Fez for the next 3 years, but it was in Fez that he learned from his Marinid host. He was entranced by the architecture and the knowledge that surrounded him, and he was not the only one to be dazzled. His vizier, Ibn al-Khatib, who had joined him in exile, was also duly impressed. As I've mentioned before, Ibn al-Khatib was a polymath. He was a writer, a politician, a poet, even a historian. Ibn al-Khatib had worked for many years at the highest levels of the Emirates government. He had established himself as a very knowledgeable man. As a result, the young sultan favored his wisdom, and a strong bond was created between the two. It was during this time of exile in Fez that Ibn al-Khatib became acquainted with the court poet, a man named Ibn Zamrak. This man had also followed the sultan into exile and had a remarkable intellect. Ibn al-Khatib recognized this and took the poet, Ibn Zamrak, under his wing and nurtured him. He promoted him up the line and eventually introduced him to Muhammad V. These three men immediately hit it off, creating a powerful working association. They used their time in Morocco wisely, gaining insight from one another, advancing their respective knowledge, and plotting how one day they would return to their homeland in Granada. Now, meanwhile, back in Granada, things had gone from bad to worse. Ismail II was a very ineffective ruler. He was very vain, he was somewhat effeminate, he angered the nobles, alienated the people, and it wasn't long until his co-conspirator, that is the other guy who helped lead the coup, if you recall, Muhammad VI, decided to rise up and overthrow him. And surprisingly, this wasn't that hard to do. Ismail II was captured, and I should add very quickly, before being dragged in chains to the dungeons below Granada, where he was tortured in horrific ways and then summarily executed. And again, this happened by the hand of his own family. What's that old statement? Payback is a... how does that go? Now, where Ismail II may have come across as a bit unmanly, Muhammad VI, who replaced him, was very much the opposite. He was coarse, rough around the edges, and with bright red hair. The Castilians would even go so far as to call him El Bermejo, the redhead. El Bermejo lacked diplomatic finesse, but he made up for this with boldness, even if it was a bit misdirected and some would argue even crazy. In fact, he was so bold that he canceled Granada's tribute to Castile and threatened to become allies with Aragon. Now, if you were Peter I of Castile, engaged in a mortal struggle with Aragon, and your vassal decided to turn off the tap of funds just when you needed it the most, and then opted to become allies with your most hated enemy, how would that make you feel towards this new ruler? It would be a bit of an understatement to say that Peter had had enough of this, and desperately needed Muhammad V out of exile and back in the throne. Now, as all of this was going on, back in Morocco, the Sultan in exile had been busy gathering his followers into a fighting force. In 1361, he landed back in the Emirate and rallied his forces at the city of Ronda. He was able to bring together a sufficient army to go on the offensive, and from here he marched out, taking a bunch of surrounding cities. Peter of Castile, during a ceasefire with Aragon, came to the Sultan's aid and retook several border cities. In doing so, the Castilian king pinned down El Bermejo's army, which in turn gave Muhammad V the initiative, and thus in March of 1362 the Sultan retook the port city of Malaga. With this victory, Muhammad V had managed to turn the tide. El Bermejo, who was becoming increasingly despised by his own people and on hearing of the loss of Malaga, panicked and fled from Granada with his family and his remaining supporters. Being such a nice guy, he decided to raid the treasury on the way out the door. El Bermejo was, how do I say this kindly, not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. Of all the places that he could have run to, he decided to go to Castile and throw himself at the mercy of Peter. Now remember when I said that Peter I of Castile had many names? One of his names was Peter the Just, but he was also known as Peter the Cruel. Brian Catlos, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, describes what happened next. Quote, "What followed was one of the many occasions that Peter would live up to his infamous nickname, the Cruel. The day after El Bermejo and 36 of his dignitaries were treated by the Castilian king to a welcome feast, Peter had them taken out to a field where he personally drove his lance into El Bermejo before ordering the rest to be slaughtered in cold blood. As an act of amicable courtesy, Peter had their heads sent back to Muhammad V as gifts. As for the abundant treasure El Bermejo had brought with him, Peter kept that for himself." End quote. Muhammad V was now restored as the ruler of Granada, and his strong working relationship with the Castilian king was reestablished. The golden age of the Nasrid had begun. For nearly the next 30 years, Muhammad V would rule Granada through an age of peace and prosperity that was unrivaled in the history of the Nasrid dynasty. His true strength lay in his cunning use of diplomacy and knowing when and where to act. The man was a proverbial chess master of international relations. He had that insight to see 4 steps ahead and what would and would not favor him. He would re-establish peace treaties with his Muslim neighbors along the entire length of North Africa, from the Marinids of Morocco to the Hafsids of Tunisia and even the Mamluks of Egypt. He would then do the exact same thing with the Christian kingdoms of the north. This peace that he established allowed trade to flourish, and with this trade came not only a boost to his economy but an influx of cultural exchange. This would be a time when art, architecture, literature, and even medicine would blossom and prosper. Peter I, again Peter the Cruel of Castile, would be enamored by his vassal's prosperity. Michael Barry, in an homage to Al-Andalus, describes this, quote, "Peter I of Castile was fascinated by the exceptional Muslim architecture, which was considered by many to be the most brilliant of the time. This appreciation was demonstrated by Peter's construction of the extraordinarily graceful Real Alcazar in Seville, which he began in 1364. This was built on an earlier Almohad building in the Islamic style, using Granadan craftsmen. It was constructed during the same era as the Alhambra buildings, with many of the styles and techniques being similar." End quote. But the Castilians were not the only ones to be engaged in a robust building program. Muhammad V would use his growing power and economy to rebuild castles, reinforce existing fortifications, expand port facilities, and even build hospitals for his people like the famous Maristan of Granada. However, without question, his greatest lasting legacy was that of the Alhambra. Washington Irving, who was an early 19th century writer who, how do we say this politely, took a lot of liberty in describing the intrigue of the Nasrid court, would state, quote, "Perhaps there never was a monument more characteristic of an age and a people than the Alhambra. A rugged fortress without, a voluptuous palace within, war frowning from its battlements, and yet poetry breathing through the fairy architecture of its halls." End quote. The Alhambra was one of the greatest family heirlooms in history. Its name was derived from the term Alhambra, meaning the red one, which was a description of the red soil on which it was built. Its position on the Sabika hill was superbly defensible, and at one point in history this was the site of a Roman fort. Later, in the mid-11th century, it was converted into a full-time fortress. The location inspired awe and caught the eye of Muhammad I, again the founder of the Nasrid dynasty. Now remember, this man had to fight in very uncertain times, and this showed in his initial plan. He laid down the foundations in 1238 and specifically began construction to revamp the outer fortifications. He reinforced the walls and upgraded them to contain mixtures of stone, adobe, and sand. This was engineered with the intention that the outer walls could better resist impact. Strong points, gates, arrow slits, and other defenses were also integrated into the master design. Furthermore, Muhammad I rebuilt the citadel on the westernmost approach known as the Al-Kazaba. To help withstand any potential siege, the river Darro was rerouted and an aqueduct was built to ensure that water would flow through the site. The Alhambra was built to withstand just about any attack. Muhammad I didn't want just a simple fortress, but rather a fully operational battle station. Now, nearly each sultan that came down the line would add a piece. Muhammad III, who was known for his bizarre cruelty, built the Partal, which comprised of the Tower of the Ladies, its surrounding gardens, and its magnificent reflecting pool. It was Ismail I that was regarded as the creator of the summer palaces, located in the vast garden area known as the Generalife. And Yusuf I helped in the creation of the Court of the Myrtles, with its long pool in the middle. Now Muhammad V, not to be outdone, would add one of the most iconic of all structures. This was an addition that showed the wealth and success of his reign: the Court of the Lions. Ibn Zamrak, the court poet, who, if you recall, had followed Muhammad V into exile, now contributed his poetry to adorn the walls. Along the basin of the Fountain of the Lions, Ibn Zamrak added, quote, "Such a translucent basin with sculpted pearl, ripples are added on by the quiet dew. Liquid and solid, marble and water, which one is truly running? See how the water overflows the borders. They are like the lover who in vain tries to hide his tears from his beloved." End quote. This was the apogee of the Nasrid. Muhammad V's contribution, with his shrewd leadership and suave politique, I've described him before as a chess master, was nearly unsurpassed by the entire Nasrid dynasty. But a great portion of his success lay in the fact that the other opponents on the board were all distracted and busy trying to kill each other. Just to the north, his friend and ally Peter I of Castile would be engaged in not just one, but a series of wars. These conflicts would consume nearly all the major players of Western Europe. Now, when the dust would finally settle from these prolonged engagements, the political scene would be changed forever, and it would end up costing Peter I more than he could possibly have imagined. Nasrid Granada during this time ironically enjoyed a golden age, but like with all golden ages, this one too would come to an end.